Now in this next chart, we are going to look at U.S. trade deficit in nominal dollars. This chart as a percentage of GDP would be better, but nobody produces a percentage of GDP chart that is as high frequency in its updating as calculated risks chart about nominal trade deficit. So this is the best that we can do at the moment. This goes back to January of 1998 when the United States trade deficit was relatively small, even as a percentage of GDP. It was only $16 billion per month. And look at the historical progression that has happened in the last 25 years. The US went from having a negligible trade deficit to a pretty high one because the price of oil was rising a lot and domestic production was not high enough. For a short while, the United States was importing 2/3 of its oil consumption. This went on for a few years, and that is why oil was a major component of the trade deficit until hydraulic fracturing began to manifest. And we see here how oil imports fell to the extent that it not just became negligible, but now the US is a net exporter of petroleum products. A net exporter. Remember, in 2010 through 14, everyone was screaming about peak oil. Now the US is a net petroleum exporter. That is truly amazing. And the United States had overcome its trade deficit challenge, or did it? At first, it seems that the United States merely traded oil imports for imports from China. Now, China itself imports a lot of oil as well, but it also exports a lot of products to the United States and other Western countries, which is why China runs a trade surplus and the United States ran a trade deficit with China. It was almost immediate. This old trade deficit going down was matched dollar for dollar with this China trade deficit going up, and that is why this blue line of total trade deficit, the sum of the red and black lines, stayed relatively stable for a long time, although shrinking as a percentage of GDP. Remember, all of these numbers are nominal, not real. And then this continued to worsen, meaning that the United States was running a huge trade deficit with China and effectively underwriting China's economic rise until COVID-19 and the need to diversify away from China. And this is underway to some extent, which is why the US trade deficit with China is not rising anymore and is in fact shrinking, even more so as a percentage of GDP. And that is why this blue line, the total US trade deficit, is among the lowest percentage of GDP of any point in the 21st century. Only the 2017-18 years might be slightly lower in terms of percentage of US GDP, and we are certainly returning to where we were in the late 1990s. This is immensely positive for the US economy as a whole, and this is also why China is having economic troubles for the first time in 30 years. Its GDP is not rising in dollar terms at all. This is the same country that went from 1 trillion to 17 trillion in GDP within just 20 years. Finally, its bills are catching up with it, and the fact that everybody has a trade deficit with China is something that the rest of the world has decided has gone too far. So this is quite wonderful from the perspective of the United States. Oil is in a slight surplus. The fact that it's not in a deficit anymore at all is very favorable, and the trade deficit with China is also not rising anymore, and therefore the total trade deficit, the blue line, is shrinking as a percentage of total GDP. This chart does not indicate a percentage of total GDP, but you can calculate that because in 2000 or so, the US total GDP was 10 trillion, and now it's 27 trillion. Therefore, 2.7 times as much of a trade deficit would be the same percentage of GDP. I will have other charts that show percentage of GDP trade deficit, but those are not updated every month like this calculated risk blog chart is. Therefore, I'm using this one. I hope you found this chart informative. Thanks for watching, and on to the next chart.